December 5, 1941. Outside Moscow, German soldiers huddle in frozen trenches, their summer uniforms offering no protection against temperatures plummeting to -40 degrees. Tank engines refuse to start. Machine guns won't fire. And through the howling wind and snow, comes a sound that would send terror through every German position, the rumble of Soviet armor and the battle cries of fresh Siberian troops, launching a massive counteroffensive. This was the moment when the German High Command's greatest miscalculation became brutally, undeniably clear. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand invasion to crush the Soviet Union in mere weeks, had not just stalled. It had become a death trap. This is the story of December 5, 1941, the day reality shattered Nazi Germany's ambitions. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, it was the largest military operation in human history. Over 3.8 million Axis troops crashed across the Soviet border on a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers. The opening was devastating. The Soviet Air Force was essentially destroyed in 48 hours. With over 1,500 aircraft obliterated on the ground. German confidence was absolute. Chief of Staff Franz Halder believed Moscow would fall before winter. The plan was simple: destroy the Red Army west of Moscow, capture the capital, and force Stalin's surrender before the first snowfall. By late November 1941, that victory seemed within reach. German forces had captured enormous swaths of Soviet territory, taken over 3 million prisoners, and stood at the gates of Moscow. On December 2, a German reconnaissance unit reached Khimki, just 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. German officers could see Moscow's golden domes through their binoculars. On November 23, Halder wrote in his war diary that Russia's military might no longer pose as a threat to Europe. But beneath this facade of success, the Wehrmacht was bleeding out. The mighty Wehrmacht that had conquered France in 6 weeks was now a shadow of itself. By early December 1941, infantry divisions were operating at 1/3 to 1/2 strength. Only 1/3 of motor vehicles remained functional. The panzer divisions had lost over 700 tanks, many not to enemy action but to mechanical breakdowns and impassable roads. The season of heavy rains had turned roads into rivers of mud. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers through hostile territory. Trucks couldn't move. Fuel couldn't reach the front. Ammunition ran low. And then came the cold. Hitler and the High Command were so convinced of quick victory, that the Wehrmacht entered Russia wearing summer uniforms. Even when it became obvious Moscow wouldn't fall until winter, no serious effort was made to provide winter clothing. Hitler feared that requisitioning winter gear would signal to the German population that the war wouldn't be the quick victory he'd promised. The result was catastrophic. By late November, German soldiers were dying not from bullets, but from exposure. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Over 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold. Vehicle engines froze solid. Soldiers lit fires under tanks just to warm the metal enough for engines to turn over. General Heinz Guderian would later write that his forces were paralyzed by the cold, unable to advance or even properly defend their positions. On December 5, as temperatures dropped to -40 degrees, Franz Halder received a stark report from Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center. Halder recorded it in his diary.
Our forces are exhausted. The 4th Panzer Group will be unable to continue the offensive tomorrow.
The Wehrmacht, which had swept across Europe like a storm, could no longer move forward. German intelligence had fatally underestimated their enemy. They believed the Red Army was finished, a spent force with no reserves, no capacity for counteroffensive. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated that Soviet forces had nothing left. They were catastrophically wrong. Stalin had received crucial intelligence from his master spy Richard Sorge in Tokyo, Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. This single piece of intelligence changed everything. Stalin immediately began transferring entire armies from Siberia and the Far East. By early December, the Red Army had accumulated a 58-division reserve, over 1.1 million men, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft. These weren't shell-shocked remnants. These were fresh, well-equipped troops trained specifically for winter warfare. On December 5, 1941, General Georgy Zhukov unleashed this force. The counteroffensive began on the Kalinin front and spread rapidly. Soviet forces attacked along a massive front from north to south of Moscow. The Germans, freezing in their positions, couldn't mount coherent defense. Their tanks wouldn't start. Their artillery was frozen. Their soldiers, suffering from frostbite and exhaustion, couldn't retreat fast enough. Within days, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat. Soviet forces drove them back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. By early January, German forces had been pushed back 150 to 400 kilometers west of their furthest advance. The Battle of Moscow had become the Wehrmacht's first major defeat since the beginning of World War II. The psychological impact on German leadership was seismic. On December 8, just 3 days after the Soviet counteroffensive began, Hitler signed Directive 39, ordering the Wehrmacht to assume a defensive posture along the entire Eastern Front. The word defensive had never before been associated with the Wehrmacht in this war. But Hitler couldn't accept reality. When generals like Guderian requested permission to withdraw to defensible positions, Hitler refused. He issued his infamous order, defend every patch of ground, even if it means digging trenches with howitzer shells. The purge began immediately. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch was dismissed on December 19. Hitler assumed personal command of the army. Field Marshal von Bock was removed. Guderian, Erich Herpner, and Adolf Strauss were sacked. 4 of 22 corps commanders lost their positions. The casualties told the story. Between October 1941 and January 1942, Army Group Center officially reported 35,000 killed, 128,000 wounded, and nearly 10,000 missing. Historians believe actual casualties were double or triple these figures. In December alone, Army Group Center lost approximately 800 tanks, 983 artillery pieces, 473 heavy mortars, and 800 anti-tank guns, destroyed or abandoned in the retreat. But the greatest damage wasn't measured in equipment or men. It was psychological. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility had been shattered. What did German generals realize on December 5, 1941? First, they realized the fundamental flaw in their strategy. Operation Barbarossa was designed as a blitzkrieg, a lightning war. But the Soviet Union was not Poland or France. It was a vast expanse with seemingly infinite depth. Even if Moscow had fallen, the war would not have ended. The Germans had planned for a sprint but found themselves in a marathon they couldn't win. Second, they realized the catastrophic failure of their logistics. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht's supply lines had collapsed. They had advanced so far, so fast, that they'd outrun their own supply capacity. By late December, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was forced to launch a public appeal for German civilians to donate winter clothing to soldiers. Between December 27 and January 4, over 76 million items were collected. It was an astonishing admission that the government couldn't equip its own army. Third, they realized they had fundamentally underestimated their enemy. The racism at the heart of Nazi ideology had blinded German planners to reality. Soviet military doctrine, industrial capacity and manpower reserves had all been dismissed. December 5 proved them catastrophically wrong. Fourth, and most importantly, German generals realized that the window for victory had closed. Germany was now engaged in exactly the type of war it couldn't win, a prolonged war of attrition on multiple fronts. By December 1941, Germany was fighting Britain in the west, the Soviet Union in the east, and, after Pearl Harbor on December 7 and Hitler's declaration of war on the United States on December 11, would soon face American industrial might. The mathematics of war had turned against them. There was no going back. December 5, 1941, didn't officially end Operation Barbarossa, that would take months more of brutal fighting. But it marked the moment when German military leadership understood the truth: they had made a fatal mistake. The Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that blitzkrieg had limits, and that Nazi Germany had bitten off far more than it could chew. The Eastern Front would become a meat grinder that would consume the Wehrmacht. Of the approximately 13 million German soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front during World War II, over 10 million would become casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. It all began with the hubris of believing a quick campaign could conquer the vast Soviet Union. And it ended with the sobering realization, on December 5, 1941, that Operation Barbarossa wasn't just failing, it was the beginning of Nazi Germany's destruction. The myth of invincibility died in the snow outside Moscow. And with it, any real hope of Nazi victory. This was December 5, 1941, the day the tide of World War II began its irreversible turn.